So you're going to be hearing from Dr. Alisha Hines. Alisha also received her PhD from Duke in 2018, and I first got to know her as a student leader. I was overseeing graduate and professional engagement, and Alisha really helped me think about new ways that we could engage our graduate students and alumni more effectively, and I'm eternally grateful for her early candor on that. And I'm really proud of the fact that, I don't know if you've noticed, but all of our speakers today are associated with the graduate and professional schools, so that's really incredible. And Alisha is a proud Chicagoan and now a North Carolinian, and where she's a professor at Wake Forest University, and she researches gender and slavery. And I looked up some of the courses that she's teaching. She's teaching a class called The Atlantic Since 1500, and a whole host of others that just look really fascinating. And she's finishing her book, which I'm going to read so I get the title correct, Geographies of Freedom, Gender, Mobility, and the Spectrum of Liberty in the Western River World. And I know we're going to hear more about that today. So welcome to the stage, Dr. Alisha Hines.
Thank you, Nicole, for the introduction. I'm happy to be back to see you and Letitia and other folks. Thank you all for being here, sharing your time. And I'm going to take us way back to the mid-19th century, so hopefully you find it interesting, enjoyable. So in general, Nicole said a little bit about the research that I do, but just to kind of situate you in the field, I guess, or the historiography, my book is really interested in pushing against some of these binaries and boundaries that we use to think about the 19th century and slavery, especially as it relates to gender. So I'm interested in kind of pushing against this boundary between free territory and slave territory, women being relegated to particular kinds of spaces as opposed to men, and particularly women having access to mobility is what my work is interested in. So go from there. Geographies of Freedom explores Black women's labor, mobility, and legal and extra-legal pursuits of freedom in the antebellum Middle Mississippi River Valley. My book is a history of the ways in which Black women navigated the uneven and ever-changing legal, social, and political terrain of the Middle Mississippi River Valley. In this world, Black women crafted freedoms of their own imagining and in turn shaped the world around them. I'm going to tell you a little story to kind of continue to help situate you in this space and time. So on September 14th, 1855, a 24-year-old bright mulatto woman named Celeste hired herself out as a chambermaid on the Reindeer, a Western River steamboat. Although an enslaved woman, she had done so many times before. Her owner, Stephen Ridgely, allowed the French and English-speaking woman the freedom to, quote, make her own bargains with boats, end quote. This meant that although Ridgely collected her earnings, Celeste could negotiate her wages in terms of service with steamboat captains or their agents without Ridgely's direct supervision. This time, however, when Ridgely returned from a trip east that he took over the summer of 1855, he found that Celeste had used her freedom of movement to escape slavery. When the Reindeer docked in the Free Territory of Illinois, Celeste got off and never returned. A year after Celeste fled, Ridgely sued the Reindeer for his loss. In their defense, the officers and captains of the boat claimed that Celeste told them she had the authority to go upon any steamboat she might select and control her own movements and employ her time where and in such manner as she might choose. In the end, the St. Louis Court of Common Pleas awarded Ridgely the $1,000 he sought in damages. The court's ruling, however, did not change the fact that Celeste had seemingly successfully escaped and had had plenty of opportunities to do so. Her story challenges us to think differently about the gendered world of antebellum steamboat transportation, and it forces us to consider how enslaved and free Black women negotiated this world and helped to transform it into a site of the making of race, gender, and freedom. Most historians of antebellum water work have tended to emphasize that Black men claimed independence, radical masculinity, and elite social status through this line of work. and as a result avoided emasculation by the savagery of slavery. These scholars use descriptive terms like hero and rascal, or radical and jacobinal, to characterize the spirits of Black watermen. Because waterscapes have been gendered male in our historical imagination, radical independence and liberatory transformation has been placed out of the reach of Black women. My research shows, however, that within the male-dominated steamboat world, Black women who ran the river defied social hierarchies and took advantage of opportunities that were never meant for them. By the 1840s and 50s, steamboats had become a quite popular and culturally significant form of travel. Competitive steamboat owners seeking to capitalize on the increased popular demand for steamboat travel drove improvements in passengers' accommodations. Passengers' cabins were outfitted with private berths, saloons, dining rooms, and a service staff of cooks, waiters, cabin boys, and chambermaids. Those who could afford it enjoyed an enclosed living space, lavish meals, and plush saloons. In 1857, the Royal Mail Through Line Company advertised its first fleet of upper cabin steamers built expressly for lake and river navigation, commodious, staunch, and in every respect well-found, with every requirement for safety, fitted and furnished with every modern convenience and comfort. Steamboats, as both physical and social spaces, were sites of struggle over sociocultural meaning. Black women's presence in this public space and their participation in this labor industry was in part reconciled by their confinement to positions of servitude. Chambermaids washed and ironed table linen and towels, staterooms washed closets on the boats, they changed beds and performed any other task related to the upkeep of the domestic spaces of the boat. White boat captains, passengers, and the broader public could thus view their presence through the stable prism of private domestic labor relations. But steamboats simultaneously disrupted that social paradigm by offering Black women access to mobility. On the river, they could evade the violent intimacy of the mistress's household and sometimes earn wages for the same kind of labor performed by domestic slaves. Chambermaids who were skilled at washing could earn money off of the books, and sometimes they could keep this from being transferred to their owners, and often they used it to purchase their freedom. But the freedom of the river world did not come without a cost. Chambermaids either worked alone or for short stints of time with one or two other women they might not know, and as a result, they were uniquely conspicuous in this environment and subjected to heightened surveillance and threats of sexual violence. Literary illustrations of steamboat culture from the period are littered with commentary on the physical appearance, strength, or disposition of Black river workers, and Black women were particularly vulnerable to critique. One passenger on a Louisville, Kentucky steamboat said her mouth was too wide, but accepting this defect, her features were very fine. I think she might have been a quadroon from descriptions I have read of their personal appearance. The passenger wrote of this Black chambermaid that she happened to be particularly lazy and described that she went slowly somnambulizing about, which means sleepwalking, laboriously yawning, stretching herself industriously, and diligently doing nothing. Black women's isolation on steamboats made them vulnerable to other kinds of threats against their safety and freedom as well. The suggestion in the last line of these lyrics of a sexual relationship between a chambermaid and a steamboat captain intimates the possibility of sexual violence that would have shaped Black women's river work experiences. When one chambermaid repeatedly appealed to the Louisiana courts after enduring years of sexual abuse by several steamboat captains, the state Supreme Court ruled that boat captains had the right to use whatever force they deemed reasonable to maintain discipline. When asked about her tenure working as a chambermaid on the steamboat Magnolia, Martha Paris explained, quote, "I was on her about 3 months. The first time I went on her, she went down in September, as near as I remember. I stayed on her 2 weeks after she laid up, when I got uneasy and quit and come home." Although Paris didn't explain what she meant by being uneasy, and we can never be sure, there were several reasons why she might have been inclined to take a break from her work on the boat. but she benefited enough from the job that she was willing to go back, which underscores the value Black women placed on the opportunities river work provided them. In the end, whatever freedom they could pursue on the river was indeed bargained. There are volumes of popular and fictional literature about the Mississippi River, but very little addresses the historical subjects I'm interested in. This quote from Mark Twain's Life on the Mississippi comes at a moment in the book when Twain is increasingly bewildered by his steamboat pilot training. And at this moment, his mentor is explaining to him that the successful piloting of the river is dependent on the constant movement of the boat in the surrounding landscape. For Black women in the river valley, the hills that parted into a V shape or hid behind one another were the sociocultural, political, and often legal nuances that defined the spaces through which they moved. They were the captains, crew, and boat passengers who were often unfamiliar and whose attitudes about slavery and inclinations toward violence and demonstrations of mastery were unpredictable. And of course, Black women's evaluations of these shifts in the landscape were not always accurate. If they did not actually lose their lives, some of their stories ended in Twain's proverbial graveyard, such as those who were raped in staterooms, captured while attempting to escape, or who never got the chance to return to their loved ones. Life on the river was precarious for Black women, but even as they were themselves being surveilled, Black women watched, learned, and evaluated their environment in order to pursue freedoms of their own making. Black river women defied a multitude of existing boundaries between slavery and freedom, as well as the binding motif of masculine mobility in their pursuits of freer lives. And in doing so, they both made and were made by the geographies of slavery and freedom in the Western river world. Thank you.
Questions?
Hi, thanks so much. It's very interesting. Can you talk a little bit about your primary sources for your research?
Sure, yeah. I use a lot of court records, so many of the quotes that I read from come from cases in which slave owners are suing steamboat captains for the total loss of their enslaved people that they've hired out to work on steamboats. I also use actual steamboat ledgers to give me a sense of where and when and for how long Black women traveled on these boats. I also use Civil War widows' pension records, which give a good sense of the women who worked on the river but whose husbands fought in the Civil War. It's one of the kind of really rich sources that we have about the interior lives of Black women and their kind of family structures, how they raised their children, the kinds of female friendships that they maintained. And several manuscript collections and things like that are also a part of my primary source collection. Yeah.
Thank you. I was wondering if you saw, I think it's the Washington Post yesterday, but it reminded me a little bit of your research when you were talking about the images of slavery. And are you familiar with about the textbooks that are being used across the country in high schools and how they're portraying women? And so there was one part about using women to have more slaves. I mean, I think it was Thomas Jefferson, but the other images were about how women were kind of portrayed in the textbooks about that area. You know, other people saw this article. Anyhow, it's very similar to how you were describing the beginning, and I had no idea is so prevalent in high school textbooks.
I mean, there's many scholars have written about the kind of fact that Black women, enslaved women, carry this enormous symbolic and representational weight. And so not simply for the fact that they actually reproduced laborers and enslaved laborers for their owners, but also when you're thinking about medical knowledge, accounting practices, you kind of name, the process of knowledge production in the 19th century, often you find enslaved women at the center of it, either as, those who are being experimented on, counted, represented in travel literature, as I've shown. So it's definitely a pervasive practice.
All right, great, thank you. Thank you very much.